An arrow leaves an Aramean bow during battle and finds the narrow opening in a king's armor. Ahab, ruler of Israel, has entered the fighting in disguise. He's been warned that the campaign will end in disaster, and he has taken precautions against becoming an obvious target. None of it matters. He remains upright in his chariot while his blood drains into its floor, watching the battle turn against him until evening. By sunset, he is dead. The queen outlives him. Jezebel remains in Jezreel while the judgment pronounced against their dynasty waits through the reigns of their sons. Then a chariot comes driving toward the city with the furious speed of Jehu, a commander newly anointed to destroy the house of Ahab. Jezebel paints her eyes, arranges her hair, and appears at a palace window to confront him. Below that window lies the ground where Naboth was murdered after refusing to surrender his ancestral vineyard to the crown. Between the arrow and the window stands a royal house that repeatedly heard the word of the Lord and repeatedly attempted to outmaneuver it. There was fire on Mount Carmel, rain after years of drought, foreign armies broken in battle, an innocent landowner condemned through false testimony, and prophets threatened, struck, imprisoned, or pursued. At the center were Ahab and Jezebel, a king who wanted power without prophetic restraint, and a queen who knew how to turn royal authority into decisive action. Their reign made Israel stronger among the kingdoms around it, but it also brought the nation into a conflict no army, treaty, disguise, or palace wall could settle. The road to those judgments began when Ahab, son of Omri, took Israel's throne in Samaria. The kingdom he inherited was already separated from the house of David in Jerusalem. After the death of Solomon, the northern tribes had formed their own state under Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Jeroboam feared that continued worship at the temple in Jerusalem might draw the loyalty of his people back toward the southern kingdom of Judah. He therefore established royal sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan, placing a golden calf at each, and appointing a religious system that served the political independence of his kingdom. That decision became the standard by which later kings of Israel were judged. Dynasty followed dynasty, often through assassination. Kings rose, killed their predecessors, and were then removed by other men willing to do the same. Omri, Ahab's father, emerged from one of these struggles and established a more durable ruling house. He purchased a hill from a man named Shemer and built Samaria upon it. The site became Israel's capital, a defensible royal center that would remain politically important long after Omri's descendants were gone. Ahab succeeded him during the reign of Asa in Judah and ruled Israel for 22 years. The biblical assessment is immediate and severe. Ahab did more evil in the sight of the Lord than all the kings of Israel before him. The familiar sins of Jeroboam were no longer the outer limit of royal unfaithfulness. Under Ahab, Israel's court embraced another religious order with a prominence it had not previously possessed. Ahab married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. The name Sidonians could be used broadly for the Phoenician population along the Mediterranean coast, including the great commercial cities of Sidon and Tyre. These cities commanded maritime networks, produced prized luxury goods, and maintained international connections far beyond their narrow coastal territory. A marriage into that royal house linked Ahab's dynasty to a powerful neighbor. Jezebel entered Israel's account as a princess from a court where Baal worship belonged to the established order. Baal was associated with fertility, storm, and rain, the forces on which crops, herds, and survival depended. In the agricultural world of ancient Israel, worship connected with seasonal rain was no remote religious abstraction. It addressed the visible conditions of food and prosperity. That made the royal promotion of Baal especially consequential. Ahab built a temple, or royal house of worship, for Baal in Samaria. Inside it, he erected an altar, He also made an Asherah, a cultic object associated with a Canaanite goddess. These were public acts performed by the king in his capital. Baal worship was not confined to a private preference within the palace. It received architecture, patronage, and institutional standing at the center of the kingdom. The result was a direct contradiction of Israel's covenant. The Lord had not presented himself as one territorial deity among many, suitable for one set of needs, while Baal handled rain and fertility. Israel's foundational confession required exclusive allegiance. The land, its harvests, its security, and the life of the people were gifts governed by the Lord who had brought them out of Egypt. Ahab's religious policy treated that claim as something the crown could disregard. Jezebel would become an active defender of the new order. She maintained prophets connected with Baal and Asherah at royal expense, and she would later use her authority against the prophets of the Lord. Yet the responsibility assigned to Ahab is unmistakable. He married Jezebel, served Baal, worshipped him, constructed his temple and altar, and made the Asherah. The king was not carried helplessly into an arrangement he did not understand. The royal program belonged to his reign. Another event recorded from Ahab's time revealed how lightly old covenant warnings could now be treated. Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. Jericho stood near the Jordan River, remembered as the first fortified city taken when Israel entered Canaan under Joshua. After its fall, Joshua pronounced a curse upon anyone who attempted to rebuild it. The builder would lay its foundation at the cost of his firstborn and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son. Generations later, Hiel undertook the work. He laid the foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and completed the gates at the cost of Segub, his youngest. The account does not pause to explain the deaths or turn Hiel into a major actor. Its force lies in the fulfillment. A warning spoken in Israel's distant past had not expired simply because kings and builders behaved as though it had. During the same reign in which Baal received a temple in Samaria, the word spoken through Joshua proved that it still stood. Then another man entered the royal account with a message that struck directly at Baal's supposed domain. His name was Elijah. He is introduced as Elijah the Tishbite from the settlers of Gilead. Gilead lay east of the Jordan, a region of uplands and broken country far removed from the Phoenician court culture represented by Jezebel. No genealogy prepares his arrival. No official position gives him access to the king. He appears carrying only the authority of the word he speaks. Elijah came before Ahab and declared, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain during these years, except by my word." The opening words challenged the assumptions embodied in Ahab's capital. The Lord, not Baal, was the living God of Israel. Elijah described himself as standing before the Lord even while he addressed the king. Ahab occupied the throne, but Elijah answered to a higher court. The judgment touched every level of life. Rain in the land of Israel was seasonal. The early rains softened the soil for planting. The later rains helped bring grain toward maturity. Dew also supplied precious moisture during dry periods. To lose both rain and dew over an extended time meant failed crops, shrinking pasture, empty storage, weakened animals, and spreading hunger. The king could maintain a temple for the storm god, but he could not command the sky. Elijah gave Ahab no ritual by which the drought might be reversed. Rain would return only according to the word entrusted to the prophet. That placed the royal court in a humiliating position. The man with no throne, army, or visible institution possessed the announcement on which the kingdom's survival depended. Once the declaration had been delivered, the word of the Lord directed Elijah away from Ahab. He was to leave, turn eastward, and hide near the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan. The confrontation therefore began with a strange reversal. Elijah had openly pronounced judgment, but he was then removed from public view. Ahab retained the palace, the army, and the machinery of government. The prophet disappeared into the country beyond the Jordan. At Cherith, Elijah drank from the brook. Ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening. The provision was regular but limited, sufficient for the day and dependent upon the command of God. Elijah was not exempt from the conditions his prophecy had announced. He lived inside the drought with everyone else. The difference was that the word which imposed the crisis also directed his steps and sustained him within it. The hiding place placed water between rocky banks in an isolated region away from the royal center. Each day the prophet drank from a source that continued only because some water still moved through the land. Each morning and evening, food arrived through creatures no human government could organize into service. Ahab's court had given Baal a house, an altar, and royal support. Elijah had a brook and the provision appointed for him. The drought continued. Across Israel, the absence of rain began changing the ground on which royal authority rested. A king might issue commands, collect tribute, negotiate alliances, and supervise cities, but none of those powers could make water fall. Ahab's religious choices had presented Baal as worthy of Israel's worship. Elijah's declaration turned the weather itself into the field on which that claim would be tested. For a time, the brook at Cherith kept flowing. Then, as the days without rain accumulated, the water diminished. The shelter chosen for Elijah was not a permanent escape from the judgment. The same drought that exposed the helplessness of Ahab's gods now reached the prophet's hiding place. At last, the brook dried up. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah and directed him northward, out of Israel and toward the Mediterranean coast. He was to go to Zarephath, a town belonging to Sidon, and remain there. A widow had been appointed to provide him with food. The destination carried its own challenge to Ahab's religious program. Elijah was being sent into the region ruled by Jezebel's father, the homeland from which Baal worship had entered Israel's royal court. If Baal truly governed rain and agricultural abundance, his power should have been most evident there. Instead, the drought had crossed political borders. The coastal territory was suffering with the kingdom that had embraced its gods. Zarephath lay between the major Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon. Its name was associated with smelting or refining, an activity requiring furnaces hot enough to separate metal from ore. Yet when Elijah reached the town, he did not find provision waiting in the house of a wealthy merchant or royal official. At the entrance to the town, he saw a widow gathering sticks. Widowhood could place a woman in an acutely vulnerable position. Household survival depended heavily upon land, stored produce, labor, and the protection of a wider family structure. A prolonged famine narrowed every source of support. This woman also had a son to feed, and by the time Elijah arrived, her household had reached the edge of its remaining food. Elijah called to her and asked for a little water in a vessel so that he could drink. She turned to get it. Even under drought conditions, she responded to the request of a stranger. Then Elijah added another request. "Please bring me a piece of bread as well." That stopped her. She answered with an oath, and the form of it showed that she recognized something about the man addressing her. "As the Lord your God lives," she said, "I have no bread." She possessed only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. She had been gathering 2 sticks so she could prepare the last of it for herself and her son. They would eat that final meal, and then, as she put it, they would die. Her words gave the famine a human scale. Royal choices and prophetic judgment had become a mother measuring flour at the bottom of a container. There was no reserve hidden somewhere else in the household, no second supply to open after the first was gone. The sticks in her hands were for the fire that would prepare everything she had left. Elijah told her not to be afraid. She was to go and do as she had said, but first she was to make a small cake of bread for him and bring it out. Afterward, she could prepare something for herself and her son. The order placed a severe demand upon her. Elijah was asking to receive food before the widow and her child ate from what she believed was their final supply, but the request came with a promise from the God in whose name she had just sworn. "The jar of flour shall not be exhausted," Elijah declared, "and the jug of oil shall not fail until the day the Lord sends rain upon the land." The promise did not describe a warehouse suddenly filled with grain. It concerned the two ordinary containers already in her possession. The jar would continue to supply flour. The jug would continue to yield oil. Each use would seem capable of emptying them, yet neither would run out before the drought ended. The widow went and did what Elijah had instructed. She gave him food, and she and her household continued to eat. Day followed day, and the jar still held flour. The jug still gave oil. The words spoken through Elijah sustained 3 lives in a town under famine. The provision was quiet compared with the public signs that would later mark Elijah's ministry. No crowd assembled to watch. No king stood nearby. There was simply a household returning repeatedly to containers that should have been empty. The miracle did not remove the drought from Zarephath. It kept this family alive within it. That distinction mattered. Elijah's presence did not immediately restore ordinary conditions or shield the town around him. The widow still inhabited a land without rain. What changed was that her dwindling supply had been placed under a promise. The food lasted because the word of the Lord lasted. The arrangement also reversed the appearance of their first meeting. Elijah had arrived as a hungry traveler asking a destitute widow to feed him. She appeared to possess nothing he could depend upon, yet the widow became the means of his survival, and his message became the means of hers. Neither royal wealth nor the institutions of Ahab's kingdom sustained the prophet. He lived through the obedience of a foreign widow and the daily fulfillment of God's promise. For some time, Elijah lodged in an upper room of her house. Then the widow's son became ill. His sickness grew increasingly severe until no breath remained in him. The death changed the meaning of everything that had happened in the house. The flour and oil had preserved the child through famine, but now another danger had taken him. His mother turned upon Elijah with words shaped by grief and accusation. "What do you have against me, man of God?" she asked. "Have you come to remind me of my sin and cause the death of my son?" She had earlier called the Lord Elijah's God. Now she called Elijah a man of God, but the title did not bring comfort. His presence seemed to her connected with exposure and judgment. The holy power that had sustained her household now appeared to have brought her guilt into view and taken her child. Elijah did not answer her accusation with an explanation. He said, "Give me your son." He took the boy from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him upon his own bed. Away from the mother, Elijah cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I am staying by causing her son to die?" The prayer was direct. Elijah had announced drought to Ahab without hesitation, but in the widow's house he appealed over the suffering of one person. He identified her as the widow who had given him lodging. She had received the prophet, obeyed his word, and shared the food she believed was her last. Her son's death seemed to fall upon the very household through which Elijah himself had been preserved. Then Elijah stretched himself over the child 3 times and cried out again, "O Lord my God, let this child's life return to him." Nothing in Elijah's own physical action could command life back into a dead body. His appeal remained entirely directed to the Lord. The prophet who had spoken with authority before Ahab now pleaded for the life of a widow's son in a borrowed room. The Lord heard Elijah. Life returned to the child, and he revived. It was a reversal without precedent in the biblical narrative up to that point. People had been rescued from danger, healed, preserved through judgment, and delivered from enemies. But here, death itself had entered a house, and a life that had ended was given back. The Lord who withheld rain and sustained food was shown to hold authority at the boundary no human provider could cross. Elijah lifted the living boy from the bed, carried him down from the upper room, and brought him to his mother. The action answered her accusation more powerfully than an argument could have done. The child she had placed into Elijah's arms without breath was returned to her alive. "See," Elijah said, "your son lives." The widow responded with a confession grounded in what she had now witnessed. "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." She had already seen flour and oil continue beyond their natural supply. She had fed Elijah in response to his promise and survived because that promise held. Yet the restoration of her son brought her recognition to its decisive form. Elijah's identity and the reliability of his message were now joined in her declaration. Her words also carried a quiet challenge far beyond the walls of her house. In Israel, the king had built an altar to Baal, while the word of the Lord was treated as an obstacle to royal policy. In Sidonian territory, a widow had tested that word with the lives of herself and her son. She had obeyed it when her food was almost gone, lived by it through famine, and received her child back through the prayer of the prophet who spoke it. The drought remained. No rain had yet been released upon the land, and Ahab still occupied the throne in Samaria. Jezebel's religious establishment still possessed royal protection. But Elijah was alive inside her native territory, sustained by a widow whom the Lord had chosen, and the household that received him had become the setting for a sign greater than survival. The jar continued to supply flour. The jug continued to yield oil, and in the widow's house her restored son stood as living confirmation that the word carried by Elijah was true. Many days passed before the word of the Lord came to Elijah again. In the 3rd year, he was told to present himself to Ahab. Rain would soon be sent upon the land. The command required Elijah to leave the household that had sheltered him and return to the kingdom where the drought had made him a royal enemy. He had disappeared immediately after announcing that no rain would fall except according to his word. Now he was to emerge before the king while the famine was still severe in Samaria. The capital could not insulate itself from the crisis. Ahab summoned Obadiah, the official in charge of the royal household. This was a position of considerable trust, placing Obadiah over the administration of the palace and close to the center of power. Yet Obadiah's loyalty to the Lord sharply distinguished him from the religious direction of the court he served. He feared the Lord greatly. When Jezebel attempted to destroy the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 of them and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each. He supplied them with bread and water, sustaining their lives while the queen used royal power against them. The palace therefore contained a conflict that Ahab and Jezebel had not eliminated. Jezebel supported the prophets of her chosen cult and sought to cut down the prophets of the Lord. Within the royal administration, Obadiah secretly preserved the people she had marked for death. His office gave him access to resources and information, but it also placed him in immediate danger if his actions became known. Ahab now gave him a different assignment. The king proposed that they search the country for springs and valleys where grass might still be found. If they could locate enough pasture, they might keep the horses and mules alive rather than lose all the animals. The search revealed the priorities forced upon the crown. Horses and mules represented transport, communication, status, and military capacity. Their loss would weaken the kingdom beyond the immediate shortage of food. Ahab could not end the drought, but he could personally inspect the remaining water sources in the hope of preserving at least part of his royal resources. The king and his official divided the land between them. Ahab traveled in one direction, and Obadiah went another way alone. As Obadiah traveled, Elijah came toward him. Obadiah recognized the prophet, fell face down and asked, "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" "It is I," Elijah answered. "Go and tell your lord, Elijah is here." For Elijah, the instruction was simple. For Obadiah, it sounded like a death sentence. "What sin have I committed," he asked, "that you would hand your servant over to Ahab to be killed?" He explained the danger. As surely as the Lord lived, there was no nation or kingdom where Ahab had not sent men to search for Elijah. When a ruler reported that the prophet was not there, Ahab required an oath confirming that he could not be found. The hunt had extended beyond Israel's own territory. Ahab apparently treated Elijah as the key to the drought and used diplomatic pressure to locate him. The prophet possessed no fortress and commanded no guards, yet the king had been unable to seize him. Neighboring rulers could testify that Elijah was not within their borders, but none could deliver the man Ahab wanted. Obadiah feared that the same pattern would now destroy him. He would leave Elijah, carry the message to Ahab, and then the Spirit of the Lord might take Elijah somewhere unknown. Ahab would arrive, find no prophet, and conclude that Obadiah had deceived him. The official had good reason to take that possibility seriously. Elijah had already vanished after confronting the king, and the search for him had failed across entire kingdoms. Obadiah could not control where the prophet went or what the Spirit of the Lord might command next. He could control only the message he carried, and if that message proved impossible to verify, Ahab could kill the messenger. Obadiah appealed to the history Elijah had every reason to respect. He had feared the Lord from his youth. Surely Elijah had heard what he had done when Jezebel killed the Lord's prophets, how he had hidden 100 men in caves and provided them with food and water. After years of secrecy, Obadiah now disclosed the act directly to Elijah. The information changed the apparent state of the conflict. Jezebel had inflicted terrible damage, but she had not succeeded in erasing the prophetic witness from Israel. 100 men were alive because an official inside Ahab's own household had risked himself to preserve them. Yet that same official was now being asked to step out from concealment in another way. Elijah wanted him to approach the king and announce that the hunted prophet had appeared. "And now," Obadiah said, "you tell me to go to my lord and say, 'Elijah is here. He will kill me.'" Elijah answered with an oath of his own. "As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to Ahab today." The assurance addressed the exact danger Obadiah had described. Elijah would not disappear after sending him away. He would remain available for the confrontation. Obadiah could carry the message knowing that the prophet had bound his promise to the living Lord he served. Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him. The king immediately went to meet Elijah. After a search that had reached through neighboring territories, Ahab finally stood before the prophet who had pronounced the drought. His first words placed the blame entirely upon Elijah. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" The accusation defined the conflict as Ahab wished to see it. Elijah had spoken the words, rain had ceased, and famine had followed. From the king's perspective, the prophet who announced the disaster was the man responsible for bringing disaster upon the kingdom. Elijah rejected the charge. "I have not troubled Israel," he answered, "but you and your father's house have, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals." Ahab had called Elijah the source of national ruin. Elijah placed responsibility upon the throne. The drought was not an arbitrary attack by a hostile prophet. It was judgment within the covenant Ahab's house had abandoned. Elijah's use of the Baals reflected the many local forms and titles under which Baal could be honored. Whatever distinctions existed among those expressions, they represented the allegiance Ahab had chosen over the Lord's commands. The king's accusation therefore failed to move Elijah. The trouble had begun in royal policy before it appeared in the weather. Elijah then issued instructions through the king who had hunted him. Ahab was to summon all Israel to Mount Carmel. He was also to gather the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table. To eat at the queen's table indicated royal maintenance and protection. These prophets belonged to an establishment supported by the resources of the crown. Elijah, by contrast, had been fed beside a brook and in the home of a foreign widow. Now, the isolated prophet demanded that the royal religious structure meet him in public. Mount Carmel was a fitting location. Its long ridge rose near the Mediterranean coast, close to the cultural border between Israel and the Phoenician world from which Jezebel had come. The heights looked toward the sea, where rain clouds would ordinarily approach the land. On ground associated with fertility and abundant growth during a famine attributed to the failure of rain, the claims of Baal and the Lord would be placed before the nation. Ahab complied. He sent word throughout Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. The king's cooperation did not amount to a confession that Elijah was right, but the drought had created a crisis that could no longer be managed through searches for pasture or attempts to locate the prophet. Elijah had appeared voluntarily, and he had proposed a public test. Refusing it would leave the king with the same famine and no answer to the man he had accused of causing it. People from across Israel gathered on the mountain. The royal prophets came under the summons of the king. Elijah stood before the assembly and addressed the people directly. "How long will you limp between two opinions?" he asked. "If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." The image was one of an uneven, wavering movement, people shifting between rival claims rather than walking steadily in one direction. Israel's crisis was not simply that some foreign worshippers had arrived from outside. The nation itself had tolerated divided allegiance. The Lord could remain part of its inherited identity, while Baal was approached for rain, fertility, and royal favor. Elijah refused to treat that arrangement as stable. If the Lord was God, the people owed him their obedience. If Baal was God, then they should follow Baal. The two claims could not govern Israel together. The people gave Elijah no answer. Their silence left the balance of visible power unchanged. The king who supported Baal was present. The prophets maintained by Jezebel's court stood together in great numbers. Elijah stood without another prophet beside him. He told the assembly, "I alone remain as a prophet of the Lord, while Baal's prophets are 450. Obadiah had preserved 100 prophets in hiding, but hidden men could not stand beside Elijah in this confrontation. On Carmel, before the king, the royal establishment, and the gathered people, he was alone. Elijah proposed the terms of the test. 2 bulls were to be provided. Baal's prophets could choose one for themselves, cut it into pieces, and place it upon wood. Elijah would prepare the other bull and place it upon wood as well. Neither side was to set fire to its offering. The prophets of Baal would call upon the name of their God. Elijah would call upon the name of the Lord. The God who answered by fire would be recognized as God. The terms removed the possibility of achieving the result through ordinary sacrifice. Both offerings would be prepared, and both would remain unlit. The outcome would depend upon an answer that neither prophets nor king could manufacture merely by completing the ritual. Baal's prophets received the first choice of animal and the first opportunity to call. Their superior numbers gave them no cause to complain that Elijah had arranged the contest for his own convenience. They could inspect the bull, prepare it themselves, and appeal openly to the God whose worship enjoyed the support of the throne. Elijah's proposal also brought the people's silence toward a decision. They had declined to answer when asked whom they would follow. Now they would watch the rival appeals unfold on the same mountain, under the same conditions, before the same unfinished altars. The people finally spoke. "What you say is good," they replied. Elijah turned to the prophets of Baal and told them to choose one of the bulls and prepare it first. They were the larger company, and he invited them to call upon the name of their God while leaving the wood unlit. They selected the bull, prepared it, and began their appeal in the morning. "O Baal, answer us." They repeated the cry while moving around the altar they had made. This was the God publicly honored by the royal house, the power associated with the storm, and the deity whose prophets had gathered in overwhelming numbers. If Baal could act, the test required only the kind of answer his worshippers claimed he was able to give. But no voice came. No one answered. The prophets continued. Their movement around the altar became the physical expression of the divided movement Elijah had just condemned in Israel. They limped and danced beside the sacrifice, attempting through sustained ritual action to obtain a response. Time passed, and the offering remained untouched. At noon, Elijah began to mock them. "Cry louder," he said. "He is a god. Perhaps he is occupied or has stepped away. Perhaps he is traveling, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened." The taunts pressed the claims of Baal worship into the situation visible before everyone. A god who needed to be summoned by louder cries could not be immediately attentive. A god who had gone on a journey could not be present. A sleeping god could not govern the storm or answer a nation suffering under drought. Elijah's words did more than ridicule the prophet's failure. They exposed the distance between Baal's reputation and Baal's response. The prophets had royal support, a prepared sacrifice, a recognized place of worship, and the attention of the assembled people. Nothing stood in the way except the silence of the God they served. The prophets raised their voices. Then they cut themselves with swords and lances according to their custom until blood flowed over them. The absence of an answer did not lead them to abandon the appeal. It drove them toward greater intensity. Their own bodies became part of the effort to attract Baal's attention. The people watching could now compare what had been promised with what was happening. The prophets of the storm god were shedding their own blood before an altar they could not ignite. Their cries had begun in the morning and had continued through noon, yet the sky gave them no fire and their God gave them no word. They entered a state of prophetic frenzy and continued until the time when the evening offering was presented. Still, there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. The repeated judgment closed every possible escape. Baal had not responded quietly, indirectly, or through some sign noticed only by his priests. There was no response at all. The prophets' numbers had achieved nothing. Their ritual knowledge had achieved nothing. Their blood had achieved nothing. The first half of the test ended with an offering still lying upon wood and hundreds of exhausted appeals unanswered. Then Elijah called the people toward him. "Come near to me." They moved closer, shifting their attention from Baal's altar to Elijah. He did not begin by preparing his bull. First, he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. The broken altar gave physical form to the condition Elijah had named. Israel had not simply added another religious option to a healthy covenant life. The worship of the Lord had been neglected while the court supported Baal. Before Elijah could place an offering upon the altar, what had been broken had to be restored. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from the sons of Jacob, the man to whom the word of the Lord had come. "Your name shall be Israel." The northern kingdom over which Ahab ruled contained only part of the political nation that had once been united. Judah and Benjamin belonged to the southern kingdom under the house of David, yet Elijah built with 12 stones. The altar represented Israel according to its covenant identity, not according to the divisions created by kings. That choice turned the contest away from the priorities of Ahab's court. The king might rule a northern state from Samaria, but the Lord's claim extended to the whole people who bore Israel's name. Their fractured politics had not dissolved their shared history or reduced the authority of the God who had named their ancestor. With the stones, Elijah rebuilt the altar in the name of the Lord. Around it, he dug a trench large enough to contain a substantial measure of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it upon the altar. Everything was now prepared as it had been for Baal's prophets, but Elijah was not finished. He told the people to fill 4 large jars with water and pour them over the offering and the wood. They did so. "Do it a second time," he said. They poured another 4 jars over the altar. "Do it a third time." They obeyed again. Water ran over the sacrifice, soaked the wood, passed down around the stones, and filled the trench. The repeated pouring made the conditions unmistakable. Elijah was not attempting to protect a hidden flame or arrange an outcome that could be mistaken for ordinary ignition. The offering, the wood, and the altar were saturated in front of the witnesses. Baal's prophets had been allowed to prepare their own sacrifice and call for hours without interference. Elijah now deliberately made his own task appear more difficult. If fire came, it would have to consume what had been drenched 3 times. When the time of the evening offering arrived, Elijah stepped forward. His prayer did not resemble the day-long frenzy that had surrounded Baal's altar. He addressed the God of the covenant by name and appealed to what the sign was meant to establish. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word." Elijah's opening joined the present confrontation to the history represented by the 12 stones. He did not introduce a new deity competing for a place in Israel's religious life. He called upon the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, the God whose dealings with their ancestors stood behind the existence of the nation itself. He also asked for his own role to be made clear. Ahab had called him the troubler of Israel. The royal court had treated him as the man responsible for the drought. Elijah now asked that the people know he was the Lord's servant and had acted according to the Lord's command. Then he prayed, "Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The purpose was not spectacle detached from allegiance. The people had refused to answer when Elijah asked whom they would follow. The fire would answer the question they had left unanswered. It would reveal the Lord as God and call Israel back from its divided loyalty. The fire of the Lord fell. It consumed the offering. It consumed the wood beneath it. It consumed the stones and the dust. It even consumed the water that had filled the trench. The answer reached every part of the prepared scene. Baal's prophets had spent the day trying to ignite a dry sacrifice and received nothing. Elijah had prayed over a drenched altar, and the fire left no portion untouched. The very materials that should have resisted burning were overtaken. The contrast could no longer be explained by numbers, ritual effort, royal patronage, or the location of the contest. Baal had been given the first appeal, the longer appeal, and the larger body of prophets. The Lord answered one prophet with one prayer. When the people saw it, they fell face down. "The Lord, He is God," they declared. "The Lord, He is God." Their silence ended in confession. Elijah had demanded a decision between rival claims, and the answer by fire brought the assembly to the ground. The name they repeated was the covenant name Elijah had invoked. The Lord, not Baal, had acted before them. For the first time on the mountain, the people responded without hesitation. They did not merely acknowledge that Elijah had performed a powerful sign. They confessed the identity the sign revealed. The Lord was God in Israel. That confession also stripped the prophets of Baal of the authority supplied by the court. Moments earlier, they had stood as representatives of a cult protected and maintained by Jezebel. Now, their God had failed publicly. Their altar remained unanswered, and the population before whom they had served as religious specialists had declared allegiance to the Lord. Elijah immediately commanded the people, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." The confrontation moved at once from verdict to judgment. The prophets had not participated as private citizens, expressing a harmless preference. They belonged to the royal system that had displaced the Lord's commands, and they had led Israel in worship of the God whose inability had just been exposed. The people acted upon Elijah's order. The great company that had surrounded Baal's altar could no longer rely upon its numbers. The assembly that had watched their unanswered appeals now closed around them. Escape routes from the gathering were cut off, and the royal prophets were taken into custody. Not one of them escaped. Elijah led the captured prophets down from Carmel to the Kishon Valley and put them to death there. The judgment was carried out beside the river system below the mountain where their public appeal had failed. The confrontation had begun as a test of divine identity, but it did not end as a demonstration without consequences. The prophets of Baal had served the royal campaign that drew Israel away from the Lord, and the covenant treated that work as a capital offense. The fire had established the verdict. At the Kishon, Elijah enforced it. Then he turned to Ahab. "Go up," Elijah told him. "Eat and drink, for there is the sound of a rushing rain." The sky had not yet changed. No cloud had been reported, and the land still bore the accumulated effects of the drought. Yet Elijah spoke of approaching rain with the same confidence with which he had once announced its absence. The judgment against the land had served its purpose on Carmel. Baal's claim had been exposed, and the people had confessed that the Lord was God. Ahab went to eat and drink. Elijah climbed back toward the summit of Carmel. There he bent down to the ground and placed his face between his knees. The prophet who had stood upright before the king and hundreds of opposing prophets now took a low posture in prayer. He had already told Ahab that rain was coming, but the promise did not make prayer unnecessary. Elijah waited upon the God who had given it. He sent his servant to a point overlooking the sea. "Go up and look toward the sea." The servant went, looked, and returned. "There is nothing," he said. Elijah told him to go back. The Mediterranean lay to the west, the direction from which rain clouds might approach Carmel. From the mountain's height, the servant could scan the horizon, while Elijah remained bowed in prayer. The first inspection revealed nothing, so did the next. Elijah sent him again and again. 6 times the servant looked toward the sea. 6 times there was no visible sign that the drought was ending. Elijah did not revise his message to Ahab or leave the mountain. He continued praying and continued sending the servant back to look. On the 7th visit, the report changed. "A small cloud is rising from the sea," the servant said. "It is about the size of a man's hand." After years without rain, the first visible sign was not a storm front stretching across the horizon. It was one small cloud. Yet that was enough for Elijah to act. He sent an urgent message to Ahab. "Harness your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." The king needed to leave the mountain before the routes below became difficult for a chariot. The scale of the coming rain was still hidden inside the small cloud, but Elijah treated the danger as immediate. The sky rapidly darkened with clouds. Wind rose, and a heavy rain began. Water returned to the land Baal had failed to relieve. It came only after the word of the Lord sent Elijah back to Ahab, after the public test on Carmel, and after Elijah prayed on the mountain. The rain answered the drought without weakening the verdict that the fire had given. The Lord who answered from above the altar also commanded the storm. Ahab rode toward Jezreel. Jezreel lay east of Carmel, in the broad valley that carried its name. It was one of the important royal centers of Ahab's house, a place where the monarchy maintained a residence away from the capital at Samaria. The route from Carmel crossed a considerable stretch of country, now being struck by the returning rain. The hand of the Lord came upon Elijah. He gathered up his garment so that it would not impede him and ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. The image closed the public events of Carmel with the prophet moving before the king. Ahab had arrived at the mountain as the ruler who accused Elijah of troubling Israel. He left after watching Baal's prophets fail, the Lord's fire fall, and the rain return at Elijah's announcement. The man he had hunted now ran before his royal chariot toward the city. But Carmel had not removed the other power within Ahab's court. When Ahab reached Jezreel, he told Jezebel everything Elijah had done. He also reported how Elijah had killed all the prophets with the sword. The king had witnessed the entire confrontation. He could report the unanswered cries, the fire upon the altar, the confession of the people, and the arrival of rain. Yet the immediate royal consequence came through the part of the report that concerned Jezebel's prophets. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah. "So may the gods do to me, and more also," her message declared, "if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like the life of one of them." She answered the death of Baal's prophets with an oath sworn in the name of her gods. The failure on Carmel did not cause her to abandon them. The public verdict did not end her use of royal authority. She set a deadline and promised Elijah that within a day he would share the fate of the men killed at the Kishon. Her response transformed the situation immediately. On the mountain, Elijah had faced hundreds of prophets before a gathered nation. Fire had vindicated him, and the people had acted on his command. In Jezreel, one message from the queen made clear that the religious structure behind those prophets remained dangerous. The people had cried, "The Lord, He is God," but Jezebel still occupied the palace. Ahab had carried the report home, but he did not restrain her threat. The contest had changed what Israel knew. It had not yet changed who controlled the court. Elijah saw the danger and fled for his life. He left the region of Jezreel and traveled south. The man whom Ahab's agents had failed to find during the drought was now moving openly away from the royal center, not under a command to confront the king, but in response to the queen's promise to kill him. The reversal was severe. Only a short time earlier, Elijah had summoned Ahab, the prophets, and the people to Carmel. He had ordered the seizure of Baal's servants and announced the return of rain. Now Jezebel had placed him under sentence, and he was leaving Israel. He traveled to Beersheba, at the southern edge of Judah. Crossing into the kingdom of Judah placed distance and another political boundary between Elijah and the house of Ahab. Beersheba had long marked Israel's southern extent in traditional descriptions of the land. Reaching it meant that Elijah had passed far beyond Carmel, Jezreel, and Samaria. His servant had accompanied him that far. At Beersheba, Elijah left the servant behind. Then he continued alone for a day's journey into the wilderness. The landscape now matched the narrowing of his position. The crowd from Carmel was gone. Ahab's chariot was gone. Even the servant who had watched the sea for signs of rain remained behind. Elijah entered the wilderness with no human companion named beside him. After a day's travel, he came to a broom tree and sat beneath it. The broom tree could provide a patch of shade in the open country, but it was not a destination that resolved anything. Elijah had escaped Jezebel's one-day deadline by placing distance between himself and Jezreel. He had not been given a new public assignment, and the victory on Carmel had not produced the national change its confession seemed to promise. Under the tree, Elijah asked that he might die. "It is enough," he said. "Now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." He had not surrendered himself to Jezebel, but neither did he ask to continue the struggle. The queen had threatened to make him like the dead prophets of Baal. Elijah now placed his life before the Lord and asked for its end on different terms. His prayer marked the depth of the collapse that followed Carmel. The prophet had called Israel back, but Jezebel's power remained. He had lived through drought and confrontation, only to reach the wilderness, believing that his own work had not carried him beyond the limits of those who came before him. There, alone beneath the broom tree, Elijah stopped running. He lay down beneath the broom tree and slept. Then an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." Elijah looked, and near his head he found bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate, drank, and lay down again. The provision met his immediate physical need without yet addressing the prayer he had made. Elijah had asked to die, but the first answer he received was food, water, and rest. His life was not taken from him, nor was he immediately sent back toward Jezreel. He was allowed to sleep. The angel of the Lord returned a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." A journey had now been set before him, though its full purpose had not been stated. Elijah rose and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Horeb was another name associated with Sinai, the mountain where Israel had entered covenant with the Lord after leaving Egypt. Moses had stood there when the nation received the commands Ahab's house had abandoned. Elijah had fled from a crisis created by that abandonment, and his journey carried him back toward the place linked with the covenant's beginning. The 40-day journey also placed Elijah within the pattern of Moses, who had remained before the Lord on the mountain for 40 days and nights. Yet Elijah arrived not as the leader of a newly delivered people, but as a prophet fleeing from a queen within Israel itself. The danger was no longer Pharaoh's power over Israel. It was the use of Israel's own throne against the Lord's servants. Elijah entered a cave and spent the night there. The word of the Lord came to him with a question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The question required him to put his flight into words. Elijah answered by describing both his service and the condition in which that service had left him. "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts," he said. "The Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Elijah's answer moved from the nation's disobedience to his personal isolation. The covenant had been forsaken, the places of worship had been destroyed, the prophets had been killed. Jezebel's threat now seemed to bring the entire pattern to completion in him. The events on Carmel had not erased that assessment. The people had confessed the Lord when the fire fell, but Elijah had left Jezreel under a death sentence. From the cave, the public victory looked unable to overcome the royal hostility that remained. The Lord told him to go out and stand on the mountain. Then the Lord passed by. A great and powerful wind tore into the mountain. It broke rocks apart before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake. The mountain itself shook, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came fire. Elijah had already seen fire answer his prayer on Carmel, consuming the offering and everything around it. Here fire appeared again, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire came the sound of a low whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle. He went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. The sequence did not deny the Lord's power over wind, earthquake, or fire. Each unfolded as he passed by. Yet Elijah was not directed by the violence of those signs. He responded to the quiet voice that followed them. The prophet who wanted a decisive end to Israel's rebellion was brought out of the cave to listen. The voice asked him again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah gave the same answer. "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. The Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." His circumstances had not changed while he stood on the mountain, and he did not soften his complaint. Jezebel still wanted him dead. Israel's broken covenant still stood behind the crisis. Elijah repeated the words because the problem remained real. This time the Lord answered by giving him a route back and work that would extend beyond his own ministry. "Go," the Lord told him, "return by the way you came, and go to the wilderness of Damascus." Elijah had traveled south to Horeb, away from Ahab and Jezebel. He was now sent north again, beyond Israel, toward Aramean territory. His flight would not end in permanent withdrawal. The road back would connect him with three people whose future roles would reshape the conflict. He was to anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Aram was Israel's powerful neighbor to the northeast, centered at Damascus. Its armies would become instruments of violence against Israel. The first name in Elijah's commission therefore stood outside the covenant kingdom. Israel's throne could not assume that judgment would arise only from within its own borders. Elijah was also to anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. Ahab still occupied that throne. Naming another man for kingship placed the future of Ahab's dynasty under a sentence more concrete than a general warning. Jehu was not yet advancing upon any palace, but his name had entered the divine commission given at Horeb. Finally, Elijah was to anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel-Meholah, as prophet in his place. The work would not end when Elijah's own ministry ended. Another prophet would carry the word forward, and that succession formed part of the same answer as Hazael and Jehu. Elijah had seen himself as the final surviving point of resistance. The Lord spoke instead of continuing judgment and continuing witness. The commission described the severity of what these men represented. Whoever escaped the sword of Hazael would be killed by Jehu, and whoever escaped the sword of Jehu would be killed by Elisha. The language presented a sequence from which rebellion could not indefinitely escape. Foreign invasion, dynastic overthrow, and prophetic judgment would operate within one unfolding purpose. Ahab and Jezebel might survive the moment after Carmel, but the conflict had moved beyond the question of whether they could silence Elijah personally. Then the Lord corrected Elijah's belief that he stood as the only faithful person left in Israel. "I will preserve 7,000 in Israel," he said, "all whose knees have not bowed to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him." Bowing the knee and kissing an image were gestures of worship and allegiance. 7,000 had withheld them from Baal. They had not all appeared beside Elijah on Carmel, and they had not prevented Jezebel from threatening him in Jezreel. But they existed. The answer changed the scale of what Elijah knew. His isolation under the broom tree and at the mouth of the cave had been genuine. It was not a complete picture of Israel. A preserved company remained beyond his sight, and the Lord claimed responsibility for keeping them. Elijah left Horeb. He found Elisha, son of Shaphat, plowing. 12 pairs of oxen were working the land, and Elisha was with the 12th pair. The size of the plowing team indicated a substantial agricultural operation. Elisha was not encountered in a school of prophets or at a sanctuary. He was at work in a field, guiding oxen over cultivated ground. Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle over him. The mantle was the recognizable garment of the prophet. Casting it over Elisha functioned as a call without a long public ceremony. The man named on Horeb had been found, and Elijah placed the sign of his office upon him. Elisha left the oxen and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said, "and then I will follow you." Elijah answered, "Go back. What have I done to you?" The reply left Elisha responsible for understanding and answering the call, represented by the mantle. Elijah did not recruit him through promises of safety or position. Elisha had seen the act and now had to decide what it required. He returned to the oxen. Then he took the pair he had been driving and slaughtered them. He used the wooden plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. The response made his departure concrete. The animals that had supported his work became the meal marking its end, and the equipment used to guide them became fuel. Elisha was not keeping the team prepared for an easy return to his former place. When the meal was finished, he rose and followed Elijah. He became Elijah's attendant, entering the work at the side of the prophet whose life Jezebel had threatened. Elijah no longer traveled alone, and the succession announced at Horeb had begun in an ordinary field. The next great crisis came from the north. Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, gathered his entire army. 32 kings joined him, bringing horses and chariots. Many of these kings were probably rulers of smaller cities or territories bound to Ben-Hadad, but together they formed an imposing coalition under his command. The army advanced into Israel and surrounded Samaria. A siege placed pressure upon every weakness inside a fortified city. Samaria's hilltop position made it difficult to attack directly, but walls could also become a trap. If the enemy controlled the routes outside, food and supplies would diminish while the besieging army waited. Ahab's capital had been built for defense, yet Ben-Hadad had brought enough allied forces to isolate it. From outside the city, the Aramean king sent messengers to Ahab. "This is what Ben-Hadad says, 'Your silver and gold are mine, and the best of your wives and children are mine.'" The demand reduced Ahab from sovereign king to conquered subordinate. Before a battle had settled the matter, Ben-Hadad claimed the royal treasury and the most valued members of Ahab's household. Accepting those terms would acknowledge that the king of Israel, his wealth and his family, now stood at the disposal of Aram. Ahab answered, "Just as you say, my lord the king, I and all I have are yours." The ruler who had resisted the word of the Lord yielded immediately to the words of Ben-Hadad. He addressed the foreign king as his lord and accepted the claim placed upon his possessions. Whether the first demand was intended as the formal language of submission or as a literal order for immediate surrender, Ahab gave Ben-Hadad the acknowledgement he wanted. But the Aramean king was not satisfied. His messengers returned with a second message. "This is what Ben-Hadad says, 'I sent to you demanding your silver, your gold, your wives, and your children. But tomorrow at this time, I will send my servants to search your palace and the houses of your officials. They will seize everything you value and carry it away.'" The second demand removed any remaining dignity from Ahab's submission. Ben-Hadad would not accept tribute chosen and delivered by the king of Israel. His own servants would enter Samaria, search the royal palace, search the homes of Ahab's officials, and take whatever pleased them. The threat now extended beyond Ahab's personal wealth. Every senior servant of the crown faced the invasion of his household. The city's ruling class would be exposed to foreign agents who could decide for themselves what to remove. Compliance would publicly demonstrate that Ahab could not protect even the homes of the men who served him. Ahab summoned all the elders of the land. "Consider what this man is doing," he told them. "See how he is looking for trouble. When he demanded my wives, my children, my silver, and my gold, I did not refuse him." Ahab had been willing to accept the first terms. The second message forced him to recognize that Ben-Hadad was not seeking a controlled settlement. The Aramean king had found submission and pushed past it toward plunder. The elders and the people gave Ahab one answer: Do not listen to him or agree to this. For once, the king did not decide alone. His officials had become direct targets of the demand, and the wider population faced the humiliation of seeing the capital opened to enemy search parties. Their refusal gave Ahab support for resistance, but it also closed the path of negotiation he had initially tried to take. Ahab sent Ben-Hadad's messengers back. "Tell my lord the king, I will do everything you demanded from your servant the first time, but this second demand I cannot do." His answer remained deferential. He still called Ben-Hadad his lord and himself the Aramean king's servant. He did not withdraw his original submission. He refused only the unrestricted search and seizure added afterward. The messengers carried the reply out of Samaria. Ben-Hadad answered with an oath, "May the gods deal with me and ever so severely if enough dust remains in Samaria to give each of my followers a handful." He threatened to reduce the city so completely that its remains would not provide even a handful of dust for every soldier in his army. The boast drew its force from the coalition surrounding Samaria. Ben-Hadad had 32 kings, chariots, horses, and a multitude of troops. Ahab was enclosed behind his walls. The king of Israel sent back a proverb. "Tell him, the one who puts on his armor should not boast like the one who takes it off." A man preparing for battle had no right to speak like a victor returning from it. Ben-Hadad had surrounded Samaria, but he had not yet conquered the city. Ahab's reply was brief, controlled, and pointed directly at the Aramean king's confidence. Ben-Hadad received the message while he and the allied kings were drinking in their shelters. When he heard Ahab's answer, he ordered his men, "Take your positions." The Aramean army deployed against Samaria. Inside the city, Ahab had rejected terms he could not accept, but the military imbalance remained. His proverb had checked Ben-Hadad's boast with words. It had not removed the horses, chariots, kings, and troops waiting beyond the walls. Then a prophet approached Ahab. He was not Elijah, and his name is not given. His arrival showed that the prophetic witness in Israel did not depend upon one visible man. At the moment when Ahab faced an enemy he lacked the power to control, the word of the Lord entered the besieged capital through another servant. "This is what the Lord says," the prophet announced. "Do you see this vast army? I will deliver it into your hand today. Then you will know that I am the Lord." The promise was given to a king who had done nothing in the account to earn it. Ahab had not removed Baal's temple, reversed Jezebel's policy, or sought the Lord before responding to Ben-Hadad. Yet the coming victory would not be granted merely to preserve Ahab's throne. It would reveal again who ruled Israel. Ben-Hadad's army made that lesson sharper. The coalition was visibly vast. Its size was the foundation of the Aramean king's confidence and the apparent proof that Samaria would fall. The Lord directed Ahab to look at the multitude before promising to place it in his hand. When the outcome came, the king would not be able to attribute it honestly to equal strength. Ahab asked, "By whom?" The prophet answered, "This is what the Lord says, by the young officers of the provincial commanders." These were not the most imposing warriors Ahab could display. They were junior men attached to the governors who administered Israel's districts. The promised victory would begin through a small and unexpected body rather than through a force that matched Ben-Hadad's coalition. Ahab asked a second question. "Who will begin the battle?" "You will," the prophet replied. The answer placed responsibility back upon the king. Ahab had been given a promise, but he still had to act. He could not remain behind Samaria's walls, waiting for the Aramean army to collapse by itself. He had to order the initiative while the enemy still surrounded him. Ahab counted the young officers of the provincial commanders. There were 232. He then mustered the Israelite force available behind them. It numbered 7,000. Against the multitude outside Samaria, the entire formation appeared dangerously small. Ben-Hadad had brought the combined forces of 32 allied rulers. Ahab was preparing to send a few hundred junior officers out first, followed by only 7,000 men. They went out at noon. The timing placed the advance in full view rather than under the concealment of darkness. While the Israelite officers emerged from the city, Ben-Hadad and the 32 kings allied with him were still drinking in their shelters. Ben-Hadad was drinking himself drunk. The Aramean king had ordered his army into position, but he was not personally watching every movement around the city. His confidence had already passed beyond expectation into celebration. Samaria was surrounded. Ahab had first offered submission, and the force inside appeared too small to threaten the coalition. Aramean scouts saw men coming out from Samaria and reported it to Ben-Hadad. "Men are coming out of Samaria," they said. Ben-Hadad issued the same order regardless of their purpose. "If they have come out for peace, take them alive. If they have come out for war, take them alive." Even now, he did not speak as though a genuine battle were beginning. If the men were envoys, they were to be captured. If they were soldiers, they were to be captured. He assumed his army could take the emerging Israelites without needing to distinguish negotiation from attack. The order revealed how completely Ben-Hadad believed the result was already his. Ahab had warned him not to boast while putting on his armor. The Aramean king responded by treating armed men leaving Samaria as prisoners before they had reached his lines. The 232 young officers continued forward. Behind them came the 7,000 men of Israel. The young officers reached the Aramean line and each struck down the man before him. The effect passed immediately through the besieging force. The Arameans fled and the Israelites pursued them. The soldiers Ben-Hadad had ordered to take their opponents alive could not hold their positions against the sudden attack. Ben-Hadad escaped on horseback with some of his cavalry. Ahab came out from Samaria behind the first wave. Israel struck the Aramean horses and chariots and inflicted a great defeat upon the invading army. The coalition that had threatened to reduce Samaria to dust was driven away from the city it had surrounded. The victory fulfilled the promise given to Ahab, but the danger had not ended. The unnamed prophet approached him again. "Go," he said, "strengthen your position. Consider carefully what you must do, because at the turn of the year, the king of Aram will attack you again." Ahab was not told to treat the victory as proof that Ben-Hadad could no longer threaten Israel. He had been delivered from one siege and given time to prepare for another. The prophetic warning was as practical as it was certain. Inspect the kingdom's defenses, rebuild what was needed, and expect the enemy to return. The turn of the year marked the season when military campaigning could resume. Winter rains made movement difficult, but the arrival of more favorable weather reopened roads and fields to armies, chariots, and supply trains. Ben-Hadad had months in which to replace losses and reconsider the failure at Samaria. His advisors offered an explanation that preserved their confidence in Aram while reducing the defeat to a problem of location. "Their gods are gods of the hills," they told him. "That is why they were stronger than we were. But if we fight them on the plains, we will certainly be stronger." The conclusion fit the territorial way many peoples understood divine power. A god might be associated with a particular city, mountain, river, or region. Israel's country contained ridges and highlands, and Samaria itself stood upon a hill. Ben-Hadad's servants interpreted their defeat as evidence that Israel's gods possessed an advantage there. The explanation spared them from confronting the message Ahab had received before the battle. The victory had been promised so that Ahab would know the Lord. Ben-Hadad's advisors instead converted it into military theory. They had not faced the sovereign God of Israel. They believed they had fought a collection of hill deities on favorable ground. Their solution was to choose different terrain. They also recommended a change in command. Ben-Hadad should remove the 32 kings from their positions and replace them with professional commanders. The allied rulers had brought impressive numbers, but kings with their own rank and interests did not necessarily form the most efficient chain of command. Officers directly answerable to Ben-Hadad would create a more centralized force. The losses were to be replaced exactly, army for army, horse for horse, and chariot for chariot. Aram would not return weakened. Ben-Hadad would rebuild the military strength that had surrounded Samaria and then bring it onto a plain where chariots could maneuver more effectively. "Then we will fight them on level ground," the advisors assured him, "and we will certainly be stronger than they are." Ben-Hadad accepted their advice and acted upon it. The first campaign had begun with confidence in numbers. The second would add revised leadership and carefully selected terrain. Aram's court had studied the defeat, identified what it believed had gone wrong, and prepared to prevent the same conditions from helping Israel again. At the turn of the year, Ben-Hadad mustered the Arameans and advanced to Aphek to fight Israel. This time, he did not surround Ahab's hilltop capital or wait outside its walls. The confrontation was drawn toward open country, exactly as his advisors had proposed. The coming battle would test their claim that the Lord's power diminished away from the hills. The Israelites were mustered and provisioned, and they marched out to meet the Arameans. When the two forces made camp opposite each other, the difference in size was striking. The Israelites looked like two small flocks of goats. The Arameans filled the countryside. The image made the military imbalance visible without requiring a count. Israel's army appeared as two small groups against a force spreading across the land. Ben-Hadad had restored his numbers, replaced his equipment, and returned under a reorganized command. He had the setting his advisors wanted, and the superiority they believed would decide the battle. Then a man of God approached the king of Israel. "This is what the Lord says," he announced. "Because the Arameans have said, 'The Lord is a God of the hills, but not a God of the valleys,' I will deliver this entire great army into your hand. Then you will know that I am the Lord." The first promise had answered Ben-Hadad's siege and Ahab's helplessness. The second addressed Aram's interpretation of the result. The coming victory would not depend upon Samaria's walls, a mountain position, or some territorial limit on divine power. Israel would face the rebuilt Aramean army under the conditions Ben-Hadad believed favored him. The promise again ended with knowledge. Ahab had already seen one vast army delivered into his hand, yet the Lord repeated that the outcome was intended to make him know who had acted. Receiving help was not the same as understanding it. The king still had to recognize that Israel's survival came from the Lord, whose commands his house had abandoned. The Arameans also needed their claim answered. Their campaign was now built upon a theological judgment. Israel's God could win on hills, but not on plains. The battlefield at Aphek would show whether the Lord's authority ended when the elevation changed. For 7 days, the armies remained camped opposite each other. The delay held the two forces in full view. On one side, the Israelite formation still resembled small flocks. On the other, Aram's army occupied the country around them. Every day preserved the apparent advantage of Ben-Hadad's force and the pressure upon Ahab to trust the promise he had received. On the 7th day, the battle began. The Israelites struck down 100,000 Aramean foot soldiers in a single day. The scale of the defeat shattered the confidence behind the second campaign. Ben-Hadad's advisors had blamed the hills, replaced the kings, rebuilt the army, restored the horses and chariots, and brought Israel onto level ground. None of those changes produced the result they had promised. The open plain did not expose a limitation in the Lord's reach. It exposed the error of believing such a limitation existed. The surviving Arameans fled into Aphek. The city that might have offered refuge became the setting for another catastrophe. A wall collapsed upon 27,000 of the men who remained. Ben-Hadad had begun the campaign at the head of a force that filled the countryside. By the end of the battle, his field army had been broken, and the city into which its survivors fled had become deadly around them. The king who had once dictated terms to Ahab was now trapped inside the place where he had expected to prove his superiority. He fled farther into the city and hid in an inner room. Ben-Hadad's servants came to him with one remaining strategy. "We have heard that the kings of Israel are merciful kings," they said. "Let us put sackcloth around our waists and ropes around our heads and go out to the king of Israel. Perhaps he will spare your life." Sackcloth signaled humiliation and distress. The ropes presented them as men already under sentence, ready to be led away or executed. Ben-Hadad had begun the war by demanding Ahab's wealth, family, and submission. His servants would now approach Ahab without weapons and beg for the life of the king, who had threatened to destroy Samaria. They dressed as they had proposed and went to Ahab. "Your servant, Ben-Hadad, says, 'Please let me live.'" The language reversed their former relationship. Ahab had once called himself Ben-Hadad's servant. Now Ben-Hadad used that title for himself. The Aramean king, who had claimed everything Ahab possessed, was concealed in an inner room while his representatives acknowledged Ahab's power to decide whether he lived. Ahab asked, "Is he still alive? He is my brother." Ben-Hadad's servants were listening carefully for any sign of favor. They seized upon the word immediately. "Yes," they replied, "your brother Ben-Hadad." Ahab's description lifted the defeated king from the position his own servants had assumed. Ben-Hadad was no longer addressed as an enemy under judgment, or even as a servant pleading for mercy. Ahab called him brother, the language of royal equality and political recognition. "Go and bring him," Ahab ordered. Ben-Hadad came out from hiding, and Ahab brought him up into his chariot. The chariot became a place of negotiation between the two kings. Ben-Hadad had lost the battle, but Ahab allowed him to appear beside him rather than beneath him. Mercy was rapidly becoming an agreement between rulers. Ben-Hadad offered terms. "The cities my father took from your father, I will restore," he said. "You may establish your own market streets in Damascus, just as my father established them in Samaria." The first promise addressed territory previously taken from Israel. The second offered Ahab a recognized commercial presence in the Aramean capital. Such streets could provide protected space for Israelite trade and administration inside Damascus, extending Ahab's economic influence into the city of his defeated enemy. Ben-Hadad therefore offered more than personal gratitude. He offered strategic advantages. Ahab could recover cities without another campaign and gain trading privileges in Damascus. Leaving Ben-Hadad alive might appear to turn a battlefield victory into a profitable and stabilizing treaty. Ahab accepted. "On the basis of a treaty, I will release you." The two kings made a covenant, and Ahab let Ben-Hadad go. The man who had twice invaded Israel departed alive, still king of Aram. Ahab had received him into his chariot, negotiated benefits, formalized an agreement, and restored his freedom. The decision looked politically useful. It also treated the battle as though the victory belonged to Ahab, to use however he considered advantageous. The prophetic word had described the entire Aramean force as something the Lord would place in Ahab's hand. The purpose was that Ahab would know the Lord. Once the victory was secured, however, the king handled Ben-Hadad as a valuable royal counterpart. The language of brotherhood displaced the meaning of judgment. The verdict on that choice came through another prophetic action. One of the members of the prophetic companies spoke to a companion by the word of the Lord. "Strike me," he said. The other man refused. The prophet then told him, "Because you have not obeyed the voice of the Lord, as soon as you leave me, a lion will kill you." The man departed, and a lion found him and killed him. The severity established that the command was not a personal quarrel or an invitation to meaningless violence. The prophet needed to bear the appearance of a wounded soldier, and the action had been required by the word of the Lord. Refusing to strike him was itself disobedience. The prophet found another man and gave the same command, "Strike me." This man struck him and wounded him. The injury supplied what the coming encounter required. The prophet then positioned himself beside the road where the king would pass. He disguised himself by placing a bandage over his eyes. When Ahab came along, the wounded man called out to him. "Your servant entered the thick of the battle," he began. "Someone came to me with a prisoner and said, 'Guard this man. If he disappears, your life will be taken in place of his life, or you must pay a talent of silver.'" The story described a clear military responsibility. A prisoner had been entrusted to a soldier under explicit terms. If the captive escaped, the guard would answer with his own life or an enormous financial payment. The duty required undivided attention because the consequences had been established in advance. The wounded man continued, "While your servant was busy here and there, the prisoner disappeared. He did not claim that the captive had overpowered him. He admitted distraction. The man had been placed directly into his custody and then lost because his attention moved elsewhere. Ahab delivered judgment without hesitation. "That is your sentence," he said. "You have pronounced it yourself." The king treated the case as settled by the wounded man's own account. He had accepted responsibility when he received the prisoner, knew the penalty, and then allowed the man to escape. No further testimony was needed. The guard's life or wealth was forfeit according to the terms he had repeated. Then the prophet quickly removed the bandage from his eyes. Ahab recognized him as one of the prophets. The apparent soldier was now revealed as a messenger of the Lord, and the case Ahab had judged became a judgment upon the king himself. Like the guard in the story, Ahab had received a man placed into his power. Like the guard, he had allowed that man to leave. The prophet declared the word of the Lord. "Because you have released from your hand the man I had devoted to destruction, your life shall be in place of his life, and your people in place of his people." Ben-Hadad had not been merely a defeated ruler whom Ahab was free to pardon in exchange for favorable terms. He had been placed under divine judgment. Ahab's authority over him existed within that judgment, not above it. To devote someone to destruction meant that the person had been placed irrevocably under a sentence belonging to God. Such a life could not be converted into profit, diplomatic leverage, or a royal alliance. Ahab had treated Ben-Hadad's survival as an asset he could exchange for cities and commercial rights. The prophet declared that the released life would be answered by Ahab's own. The sentence also reached beyond the king. Ahab's people would answer for the people he had released. The campaign that might have ended the Aramean threat had instead concluded with Ben-Hadad restored to power through a treaty. Ahab had judged the disguised prophet accurately. A guard who accepted custody and let the prisoner escape had made himself liable for the penalty. What the king failed to recognize until the disguise was removed was that he had just described his own decision. The encounter exposed the difference between mercy and disobedience. Ben-Hadad's servants had appealed to the reputation of Israel's kings for mercy, and Ahab had responded generously. But mercy did not give the king ownership over a judgment the Lord had pronounced. Ahab's compassion for his royal equal stood in contrast to the responsibility entrusted to him. His use of the word brother sharpened that contrast. Ben-Hadad had attacked Israel, threatened its households, returned with another army, and built his second campaign upon a denial of the Lord's authority beyond the hills. Yet when defeated, he was welcomed as a brother and released. Ahab would not extend the same kind of generosity to every person whose interests collided with his own. For the moment, the king had nothing to say against the prophetic verdict. The promised victory had become a sentence, and the treaty he had negotiated could not undo it. Ahab returned to his palace in Samaria, resentful and sullen. Near Ahab's palace in Jezreel was a vineyard belonging to a man named Naboth. Its location made it attractive to the king. Ahab wanted to convert the property into a vegetable garden because it lay close to the palace. He approached Naboth with what appeared to be a generous offer. "Give me your vineyard," Ahab said. "I want to use it for a vegetable garden, since it is near my house. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard. Or if you prefer, I will pay you its value in silver." Ahab did not begin with confiscation. He offered Naboth a choice between improved land and a financial payment. Judged as an ordinary exchange of property, the proposal could have benefited both men. The king would gain the conveniently placed vineyard, and Naboth could receive land of greater agricultural value or its price. But Naboth did not regard the vineyard as a commodity available for royal purchase. "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers," he answered. The land belonged to the history of Naboth's family within Israel. Ancestral property was tied to the allotments by which families held a lasting place among the covenant people. It could pass from one generation to another, and the law provided ways for land lost through poverty to return to the family. Naboth's refusal was therefore grounded in obligation, not in an attempt to extract a better offer. Ahab's proposal concerned convenience. Naboth's answer concerned inheritance before the Lord. The king wanted the vineyard because it was near his palace. Naboth would not surrender it because it connected his household to the generations before him. The difference between their positions left no room for negotiation. A better vineyard would still be a different inheritance. Silver could measure market value, but it could not replace the family's claim upon that particular land. Ahab returned to his palace, resentful and sullen, because Naboth had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." It was the same disposition with which he had returned to Samaria after the prophet condemned his release of Ben-Hadad. Once again, the king encountered a limit upon his will and withdrew into resentment. He lay down on his bed, turned his face away, and refused to eat. The ruler of Israel had cities, servants, military forces, and royal residences, but he could not obtain the small tract of land beside his house through Naboth's consent. The vineyard remained where it had always been, visible near the palace and beyond the king's possession. Jezebel came to him and asked, "Why are you so sullen? Why will you not eat?" Ahab told her about the encounter. "I spoke to Naboth of Jezreel and said, 'Sell me your vineyard, or if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard in its place.' But he said, 'I will not give you my vineyard.'" In Ahab's account, Naboth's covenantal reason disappeared. He reported the offer and the refusal, but not the words that had made the refusal more than personal obstinacy. "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." Jezebel answered, "Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up, eat, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." Her response revealed a different understanding of kingship. Naboth had appealed to a law that limited the king, along with every other Israelite. Jezebel treated Ahab's inability to obtain the property as a failure to exercise royal power. In the political world she represented, a subject's claim did not need to stand against the desire of the crown. She did not return to Naboth with a larger offer. She did not challenge his interpretation before judges. She promised Ahab the vineyard and moved directly to the machinery by which the owner could be removed. Jezebel wrote letters in Ahab's name. She sealed them with his seal and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city. A royal seal authenticated an order as the act of the king. The letters did not arrive as a private request from Jezebel or as an openly personal dispute over land. They carried Ahab's identity and authority. The queen, who had promised to solve the king's problem, now acted through the legal force of his name. The recipients were not distant officials, unfamiliar with Naboth. They were the elders and nobles of his own city, the men responsible for local judgment and civic order. Jezebel's scheme required people who knew Naboth and whose public standing could make the proceedings appear legitimate. The letters instructed them to proclaim a fast. A public fast normally signaled that a community faced grave guilt, danger, or judgment and needed to humble itself. Jezebel used that solemn form to create the impression that some serious offense threatened the city. The people would gather, believing the occasion concerned their relationship with God and the welfare of the community. Naboth was to be seated in a prominent place among them. Then two corrupt men were to sit opposite him and bring an accusation. "You have cursed God and the king," they were to testify. The charge was designed for death. Cursing God was a religious crime. Cursing the king was an offense against royal authority. By combining the two, the witnesses would portray Naboth as dangerous, both to the covenant and to the state. Two witnesses gave the accusation the legal form required for a capital case. Jezebel did not order the elders simply to kill Naboth in secret. She constructed a proceeding that borrowed the outward features of justice. A public assembly, a solemn fast, recognized city leaders, multiple witnesses, a formal charge, and the prescribed method of execution. Every element intended to protect the innocent was turned against him. The fast that should have expressed repentance concealed a planned murder. The elders, who should have judged impartially, received their verdict in advance from the palace. The requirement for two witnesses became the reason two liars were placed before Naboth. The law against blasphemy became the weapon used to eliminate a man whose actual offense was refusing to violate the principle of ancestral inheritance. Once the testimony had been given, Jezebel ordered the city leaders to take Naboth outside and stone him to death. Execution outside the city would make the sentence appear to belong to the gathered community rather than to the private desire of the royal household. Many hands could participate while the king remained in his palace and the queen's name remained absent from the public charge. The elders and nobles did exactly as Jezebel had commanded in the letters. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth in a prominent place before the people. The two corrupt men came in and sat opposite him. Before the assembly, they testified, "Naboth has cursed God and the king." The accusation supplied the only guilt the proceedings required. The city leaders already knew what they were expected to do, and the two witnesses had been selected to produce the testimony needed for that result. Naboth was taken outside the city. There, he was stoned to death. The vineyard beside Ahab's palace now had no living owner standing between the king and possession. Naboth had answered Ahab with the name of the Lord and the inheritance of his fathers. Jezebel had answered Naboth with letters bearing Ahab's name, witnesses willing to lie, and stones thrown under the appearance of lawful judgment. The elders sent word to Jezebel, "Naboth has been stoned, he is dead." Their report returned to the person who had initiated the scheme, confirming that every instruction had been carried out. They did not send a record of an independently discovered offense. They reported completion. The crime had traveled outward from the palace in the king's name and returned as news of a civic execution. That distance allowed the royal household to receive the result without appearing at the place where Naboth died. But the chain of responsibility remained unbroken. Ahab desired the vineyard. Jezebel promised to obtain it. The king's seal authorized the letters. The city leaders obeyed. The witnesses lied, and Naboth was killed. When Jezebel heard that he was dead, she went to Ahab. "Get up," she told him. "Take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to sell you. Naboth is no longer alive. He is dead." Ahab rose and went down to the vineyard to take possession of it. Naboth's refusal had been removed with Naboth himself. The king did not ask how the death had been arranged or challenge the extraordinary timing by which a desired property became available immediately after Jezebel promised to provide it. He accepted the result and acted upon it. By entering the vineyard as its new possessor, Ahab made himself the beneficiary of the execution carried out in his name. Jezebel had written the letters, but the murder served the king's desire, and the land was now being claimed by the crown. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. "Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who rules in Samaria. He is now in Naboth's vineyard, where he has gone to take possession." The location mattered. Elijah was not sent to confront Ahab later in a neutral hall or along an ordinary road. He was sent into the property at the moment the king was claiming it. The scene of Ahab's gain became the scene of his accusation. The vineyard had been treated as though Naboth's death settled the dispute. From the palace's perspective, the owner was gone, and the land could pass into royal control. The word given to Elijah declared that the death had settled nothing. It had turned a rejected purchase into blood guilt. The Lord told Elijah exactly what to say. "Have you murdered and also taken possession?" The question joined the two acts that the royal scheme had separated. Naboth had been executed by his own city outside its walls. Ahab had come afterward merely to receive the property. Elijah placed murder and possession in one sentence because the second revealed the purpose of the first. Then came the sentence, "In the place where dogs licked Naboth's blood, dogs will lick your blood, yes, yours." Ahab had entered the vineyard expecting to enlarge the grounds available to his palace. Instead, the land became a witness against him. Naboth's blood would be answered by the king's blood. The possession Ahab had gained through death carried death back toward him. Elijah found Ahab there. The king recognized the prophet who had announced the drought and opposed the royal worship of Baal. "Have you found me, my enemy?" Ahab asked. The word showed how Ahab interpreted Elijah's arrival. The prophet was not welcomed as a messenger bringing the truth about what had happened. He was the king's enemy, the man who repeatedly appeared where Ahab's choices came under judgment. Elijah answered, "I have found you." Ahab had used royal authority to find ways around resistance. Ben-Hadad's siege had been overcome. Naboth's refusal had been overcome. The vineyard was in his hand, but Elijah's answer made clear that the king himself had now been located and exposed. "I have found you," Elijah continued, "because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord." To sell oneself described more than a single lapse. Ahab had given himself over to a course of action. His kingship, resources, decisions, and alliances had repeatedly served what the Lord condemned. Jezebel's influence was powerful, but Ahab's responsibility was not transferred to her. The sentence expanded from the king's blood to the future of his dynasty. The Lord would bring disaster upon Ahab. Every male belonging to his house would be cut off in Israel, slave and free alike. The royal line would not merely lose one ruler and continue through another branch. It would be swept away. Ahab had inherited the durable dynasty Omri established. He had strengthened its political connections, built extensively, survived foreign invasion, and placed his sons in line to rule after him. The judgment declared that none of those achievements could preserve his house. Elijah named two earlier dynasties as the pattern of what would happen. Ahab's house would become like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and the house of Baasha, son of Ahijah. Jeroboam had founded the northern kingdom and established the calf sanctuaries that redirected Israel's worship. His dynasty ended violently. Baasha, who destroyed Jeroboam's house and seized the throne, continued the same sins. His own dynasty received the same kind of judgment and was also eliminated. Ahab's family would now join that succession of condemned royal houses. A new dynasty could overthrow an old one, but taking the throne did not free the new king from accountability. If he continued the rebellion of his predecessors, the pattern reached him as well. Elijah gave the reason. Ahab had provoked the Lord to anger and had caused Israel to sin. The king's guilt was magnified by his office. His decisions did not remain within his own household. The temple and altar he built for Baal gave royal direction to the nation. Jezebel's prophets ate under royal patronage. The persecution of the Lord's prophets operated through court power. Naboth's death had been obtained through letters sealed in the king's name. Then Elijah pronounced the sentence against Jezebel. Dogs will eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. The queen had acted from the palace in that city. She had promised Ahab the nearby vineyard and used local officials to kill its owner. The judgment placed her own death in Jezreel, outside the security royal status was supposed to provide. No royal burial was described in the sentence. Dogs would consume her remains near the city where she had exercised authority against Naboth. In the ancient world, denial of burial deepened the disgrace of death. A queen who commanded elders and nobles would be left without the honor normally guarded by the palace. The judgment then covered the rest of Ahab's house. Those belonging to Ahab who died in the city would be eaten by dogs. Those who died in the open country would be eaten by birds. The sentence stripped the dynasty of both survival and dignity. Whether its members fell within fortified settlements or outside them, the result would be exposure rather than honored burial. The royal house that had taken an Israelite's inheritance would lose its own claim upon the future. The account pauses over Ahab's character at this point and gives an assessment more severe than the description of any previous king of Israel. There had never been anyone like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the sight of the Lord, urged on by Jezebel, his wife. Jezebel's role is stated plainly. She drove the evil forward. When Ahab accepted that Naboth's vineyard could not be purchased, she treated his restraint as weakness and took control of the outcome. She wrote the letters, arranged the witnesses, and ordered the execution. But the same assessment still says Ahab sold himself. Jezebel urged, Ahab yielded and participated. He provided the kingship whose name and seal gave her orders force. Then he went to receive the land. The narrative does not allow the king to use his wife's initiative as an excuse. Ahab acted in an especially detestable way by following idols, imitating the peoples the Lord had driven out before Israel. The practices he welcomed were not harmless additions to royal culture. They returned Israel toward the very religious corruption for which the former inhabitants of the land had come under judgment. Ahab now stood inside the vineyard with the consequences of that course pronounced over him. The land he had wanted had yielded no satisfaction in the account. It had become the place where Elijah announced his blood, Jezebel's death and the extinction of their house. When Ahab heard these words, he tore his clothes. He put sackcloth upon his body and fasted. He even lay in sackcloth and moved about in a subdued manner. The response was public and physical. Tearing clothing expressed distress. Sackcloth replaced royal comfort with the garment of mourning and humiliation. Fasting removed ordinary food. The king who had once lain on his bed refusing to eat because Naboth would not give him the vineyard now refused food under the weight of the sentence pronounced within it. Ahab did not threaten Elijah or order him arrested. He did not defend Jezebel's conduct, challenge the testimony about Naboth, or appeal to the treaty and victories that had strengthened his reign. He humbled himself. The word of the Lord came to Elijah again. Have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me? The question required Elijah to recognize the change in the king's posture. Ahab's long record of evil did not make the act invisible. The Lord saw the torn clothing, the sackcloth, the fasting, and the subdued movement. Because Ahab had humbled himself, the full disaster against his house would not come during his lifetime. It would come in the days of his son. The response did not erase the sentence concerning Ahab's own life, and it did not declare that the royal house had been restored to safety. The blood of Naboth still called for judgment. Jezebel's fate remained pronounced. Ahab's descendants still stood under destruction. What changed was the timing of the dynastic collapse. The king's humiliation secured delay, not cancellation. Ahab would not live to see the entire royal house swept away. That burden would pass forward with his throne, waiting in the future of his sons. For 3 years, there was no war between Aram and Israel. Then Ahab raised the unresolved matter of Ramoth-gilead. The city lay east of the Jordan in territory Israel claimed, but Aram controlled it. Ben-Hadad had promised to restore cities taken from Israel, yet Ramoth-gilead remained outside Ahab's possession. Ahab said to his officials, "Do you know that Ramoth-gilead belongs to us? Yet we are doing nothing to take it from the king of Aram." The treaty that had spared Ben-Hadad had not ended the rivalry between the kingdoms. Ahab now prepared to recover by war what diplomacy had left unsettled. At that time, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, came to visit Ahab. Relations between the northern and southern kingdoms had often been hostile, but Ahab and Jehoshaphat stood as allies. Ahab asked him directly, "Will you go with me to fight against Ramoth-gilead?" Jehoshaphat answered with a strong declaration of support. "I am as you are, my people are as your people, my horses are as your horses." Judah's king was prepared to join the campaign and place his forces beside Israel's, but before committing them to battle, he added a request. "First inquire for the word of the Lord." Ahab gathered about 400 prophets and asked them, "Should I go to war against Ramoth-gilead, or should I refrain?" They answered together, "Go up, for the Lord will give it into the king's hand." The response gave Ahab exactly the assurance he needed. The city belonged to Israel, Judah had agreed to help, and hundreds of prophetic voices announced victory. Jehoshaphat was not satisfied. "Is there not still a prophet of the Lord here?" he asked, "through whom we may inquire?" The question exposed a problem beneath the impressive agreement. 400 men had spoken, but Judah's king still wanted another voice. Numbers alone did not establish that the counsel truly came from the Lord. Ahab knew of one more prophet. "There is still one man through whom we may inquire of the Lord," he said, "but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, only bad. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah." Ahab did not accuse Micaiah of speaking falsely. His objection was that Micaiah's messages were consistently unfavorable to him. The king measured the prophet by whether his words supported royal intention. Jehoshaphat replied, "The king should not say such a thing." So Ahab summoned one of his officers and ordered him to bring Micaiah quickly. While the messenger went, Ahab and Jehoshaphat sat upon their thrones near the entrance of Samaria's gate. Both wore their royal robes. The open area at the gate was a place where public business and judgment could be conducted. Here the two kings appeared before the gathered prophets in the full display of their office. The prophets continued speaking before them. One of the most prominent, Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, had made iron horns. He used them as a sign of irresistible military force. "This is what the Lord says," he declared. "With these you will gore the Arameans until they are destroyed." The other prophets agreed. "Attack Ramoth-gilead and be victorious," they said. "The Lord will give it into the king's hand." The scene gave Ahab every visible reason to proceed. 2 kings sat in state. Their combined forces were available. 400 prophets spoke with one voice. Zedekiah's iron horns turned their promise into a forceful public image. Aram would be driven down before Israel. Meanwhile, the messenger sent to fetch Micaiah tried to prepare him for the occasion. "Look," he said, "the prophets are unanimously predicting success for the king. Let your word agree with theirs. Speak favorably." The messenger's concern was agreement rather than truth. A single contrary voice would disturb the confidence of the royal assembly and perhaps threaten the man who delivered it. Micaiah was being offered a safe route. Repeat what everyone else had said. Micaiah answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, I can tell him only what the Lord tells me." He was brought before Ahab. The king asked, "Micaiah, should we go to war against Ramoth-gilead, or should I refrain?" Micaiah answered with the same prediction the others had given. "Attack and be victorious. The Lord will give it into the king's hand." But Ahab did not accept it. "How many times must I make you swear to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" The king recognized that Micaiah's first answer was not his genuine message. The words matched the court prophets too neatly, and Micaiah's delivery evidently made the agreement unconvincing. Ahab demanded the truth, even though he had already explained that he hated Micaiah for giving him unwelcome truth. Micaiah then described what he had seen. "I saw all Israel scattered upon the hills like sheep without a shepherd. And the Lord said, 'These people have no master. Let each one return home in peace.'" The image overturned the scene at Samaria's gate. Ahab sat there in royal robes, preparing to lead Israel into battle. In Micaiah's vision, the people survived, but their ruler was gone. The army scattered because it no longer had a shepherd. The words, "return home in peace," did not promise success. They meant that the surviving soldiers would be released from the campaign after losing the man who commanded them. Ramoth-gilead might be the stated objective, but the vision centered on the death of Israel's king. Ahab turned to Jehoshaphat. "Did I not tell you that he never prophesies anything good about me, but only bad?" The warning had confirmed Ahab's complaint rather than changing his plan. Instead of asking whether the vision was true, he treated its unfavorable content as proof of Micaiah's hostility. Micaiah continued, "Therefore, hear the word of the Lord." He described another throne scene, greater than the one at Samaria's gate. The Lord sat upon his throne with the host of heaven standing around him on his right and left. The earthly assembly contained 2 kings and hundreds of prophets. The heavenly assembly placed Ahab's decision within a court he could neither summon nor control. The Lord asked, "Who will entice Ahab into attacking Ramoth-gilead and going to his death there?" Different members of the heavenly host offered different proposals. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord. "I will entice him," the spirit said. The Lord asked, "By what means?" "I will go out and become a lying spirit in the mouths of all his prophets." The Lord answered, "You will entice him and you will succeed. Go and do it." Micaiah then applied the vision directly to the scene before Ahab. "The Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouths of all these prophets of yours. The Lord has pronounced disaster against you." The 400 voices were not independent confirmation of a favorable future. Their unanimity was itself part of the judgment. Ahab wanted permission to pursue the campaign, and the prophetic establishment surrounding him supplied it. Yet the deception did not leave Ahab without warning. Micaiah stood openly before him and explained both the false message and the sentence behind it. Ahab now knew that the promise of victory had been challenged by a vision of his death. Proceeding to Ramoth-gilead would be a choice made after the danger had been stated plainly. Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, stepped forward and struck Micaiah on the cheek. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go when he left me to speak to you?" he demanded. Zedekiah defended his prophetic authority through humiliation and mockery. He treated Micaiah's claim as an insult to the Spirit by which he believed he had spoken. Micaiah answered, "You will find out on the day you go to hide in an inner room." The prophet did not attempt to strike him back. He pointed toward a coming moment when Zedekiah's confidence would collapse and concealment would replace his public performance. Ahab ordered Micaiah taken away. "Return him to Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash, the king's son. Tell them, this is what the king says. Put this man in prison and give him only bread and water until I return safely." The king attempted to settle the contest between the prophecies through the outcome he expected. Micaiah would remain confined under harsh rations. If Ahab returned safely, the prediction of a shepherdless Israel would be discredited. Micaiah answered, "If you ever return safely, the Lord has not spoken through me." Then he addressed everyone present. "Mark my words, all you people. The warning was no longer private counsel exchanged between prophet and king. The royal court, the assembled prophets, and the people at the gate had heard it. Ahab could imprison the speaker, but he could not make the message unknown. With Micaiah confined, Ahab and Jehoshaphat set out together for Ramoth-gilead. Before the battle began, Ahab said to Jehoshaphat, "I will disguise myself when I enter the fighting, but you wear your royal robes." Ahab removed the appearance that would identify him as Israel's king. Jehoshaphat entered the field, still dressed as a king. The arrangement carried an obvious danger for Judah's ruler. Royal robes made him visible to both armies, while Ahab blended among ordinary combatants. Ahab had rejected Micaiah's warning, but he did not behave as though it were meaningless. He took precautions against being recognized and deliberately targeted. Ben-Hadad's commanders had received orders that made those precautions important. The king of Aram instructed the 32 commanders of his chariot force, "Do not fight with anyone, small or great, except the king of Israel." The entire Aramean command was focused upon one man. Ordinary soldiers and officers were secondary. If the chariots could find and kill Ahab, they could remove the leader of Israel's campaign and settle Ben-Hadad's account with the king who had defeated and then released him. When the chariot commanders saw Jehoshaphat in royal robes, they assumed he was the king of Israel. They turned toward him and surrounded him for attack. The disguise appeared to have worked for Ahab, but it transferred the attention of the Aramean chariots to his ally. Jehoshaphat found himself at the center of a pursuit intended for another king. He cried out. The parallel account records that the Lord helped him and drew the attackers away. The commanders realized that the man in royal robes was not Ahab. Once they recognized their mistake, they stopped pursuing him. Jehoshaphat survived because the Arameans corrected their identification. Ahab remained concealed. The 32 commanders specifically ordered to kill him failed to locate their intended target. Then an Aramean soldier drew his bow and released an arrow without aiming at a known king. The arrow struck Ahab between the sections of his armor. The point found the narrow, vulnerable place the disguise could not protect. No commander had recognized Ahab. No elite chariot unit had broken through to him. A soldier who did not know he was shooting at the king accomplished what the concentrated Aramean pursuit had failed to do. Ahab told his chariot driver, "Turn around and carry me out of the battle. I have been wounded." The king now needed to escape the field he had chosen to enter. His identity had remained hidden from the enemy. But the wound made concealment irrelevant. The danger Micaiah described did not depend upon the Arameans knowing whom they had struck. The fighting intensified throughout the day. Ahab was kept upright in his chariot, facing the Arameans. His blood flowed from the wound and collected in the bottom of the chariot. The king remained a visible presence to his own army, even as his strength left him. Israel had entered the battle under a ruler disguised as an ordinary soldier. Now the wounded ruler was held in place while the conflict continued before him. Micaiah had seen Israel scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Ahab's decision to remain in the chariot delayed the moment when the army would know it had lost its king, but it could not prevent that moment from arriving. At sunset, Ahab died. As the light of the day ended, a cry passed through the Israelite army. Every man to his city, every man to his country. The campaign was over. Ramoth-gilead had not been recovered. The surviving soldiers withdrew to their homes, matching the substance of Micaiah's vision. The people returned in peace because their master was gone. Ahab had demanded that Micaiah be kept on bread and water until he returned safely. He did not return. The 400 predictions of victory collapsed with him. Zedekiah's iron horns had promised that Ahab would gore the Arameans until they were destroyed. Instead, the army dispersed. The disputed city remained under Aramean control, and Israel carried its dead king away from the field. Ahab's precautions had addressed the most predictable threat. He knew a king in royal dress could attract enemy attention, so he removed the identifying clothing. Ben-Hadad's commanders then pursued the wrong man exactly as Ahab's plan made possible. But the judgment did not come through their planned attack. It came through an unaimed shot. The arrow passed through the small opening between pieces of armor and turned a disguise meant to defeat prophecy into part of the scene in which prophecy was fulfilled. The king's body was brought back to Samaria and buried there. Ahab received a royal burial in the capital his father had built. The full destruction of his house had been delayed, just as the Lord had told Elijah after Ahab humbled himself. The dynasty did not collapse around his grave that day, but the chariot carried another part of the judgment. It was washed beside the pool of Samaria. Dogs licked Ahab's blood from it, and prostitutes bathed at the same place, according to the word the Lord had spoken. The blood that had gathered throughout the battle was emptied into a public setting where scavenging dogs consumed it. Ahab had been buried with royal formality, but the evidence of his death received no such protection. Elijah had confronted him in Naboth's vineyard with the sentence that dogs would lick his blood. The king had acquired that land through the death of its owner, and then left the vineyard under judgment. Now his own blood was exposed after the battle he had entered against prophetic warning. The sentence spoken after Ben-Hadad's release also reached its result. Ahab had been told that his life would answer for the life of the Aramean king he allowed to escape. Ben-Hadad had come out of hiding, entered Ahab's chariot, made a treaty, and returned to power. Ahab later died in a chariot while fighting that kingdom again. The political advantages of the treaty had not protected him. The cities Ben-Hadad promised did not prevent the dispute over Ramoth-gilead. The language of royal brotherhood did not prevent renewed war. Ahab had converted a defeated enemy into a negotiating partner, only to lose his life in the unresolved conflict. The record of his reign included much more than the scenes of judgment. Ahab built an ivory house and fortified cities. His government possessed the organization to raise armies, administer provincial districts, negotiate international alliances, and undertake major construction. The royal annals preserved further accounts of his achievements and power. Those accomplishments help explain why his dynasty could appear secure. Ahab was not a powerless ruler presiding over a kingdom in collapse. He commanded resources, maintained strategic relationships, and survived threats that could have destroyed a weaker king. Even the Aramean campaigns displayed an Israel capable of mobilizing men and taking the field. Yet the decisive events of his reign were repeatedly shaped by words he did not control. Elijah announced drought, and the rain ceased. A prophet promised victory over Ben-Hadad, and the vast army was defeated. Another prophet condemned Ahab for releasing the enemy king. Elijah met him in Naboth's vineyard and pronounced judgment over his blood and his house. Micaiah warned that Israel would return from Ramoth-gilead without its shepherd. Ahab resisted, negotiated, resented, humbled himself, imprisoned the messenger, and disguised his identity. Each response changed part of the route. None overturned the final word. His relationship with Jezebel had intensified the direction of his reign. She defended Baal's prophets after Carmel, threatened Elijah, and transformed the king's desire for Naboth's vineyard into a fatal conspiracy. Ahab accepted the religious order she promoted and benefited from the authority she exercised in his name. But she was not beside him at Ramoth-gilead. The choice to campaign after Micaiah's warning belonged to Ahab. The disguise belonged to Ahab. The command to imprison the prophet belonged to Ahab. His final defeat came through a decision he made as king. At the end of the day, his army survived and returned home. Ahab did not. The throne now passed to the next generation. The disaster against the entire royal house had been postponed beyond Ahab's lifetime. But the death at Ramoth-gilead moved the dynasty into the period Elijah had already named. Ahab rested with his fathers. His son Ahaziah reigned in his place. After Ahab's death, Moab rebelled against Israel. The revolt showed how quickly the death of a powerful king could affect the territories under his control. Moab lay east of the Dead Sea and had been subject to Israel. With Ahab gone and a new ruler on the throne, its people rejected that authority. Ahaziah therefore inherited more than his father's palace. He inherited a kingdom whose external strength was being tested and a royal house already living under judgment. Then Ahaziah fell through the lattice of an upper room in his palace at Samaria. The lattice covered an opening that admitted air while providing some barrier at the edge. The king fell through it and was seriously injured. Confined by the damage, he wanted to know whether he would recover. He sent messengers with an instruction. Go and consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, to see whether I will recover from this injury. Ekron was a Philistine city west of Judah. Ahaziah looked beyond Israel for an oracle from a foreign god. His father had appealed to Baal through the religious establishment supported by Jezebel. The son now sent an official delegation to another center of Baal worship for knowledge about his own life. The question was understandable. Would the king survive? But the destination of the inquiry made the act a continuation of the conflict that had defined Ahab's reign. Ahaziah occupied Israel's throne while seeking his answer from Ekron. The living God, whose word had governed drought, battle, and royal succession, was ignored by the king responsible for leading his people. The angel of the Lord spoke to Elijah. Go up and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria. Elijah was to intercept them before they completed their journey. Once again, a royal plan involving Baal brought Ahab's house into direct contact with the prophet Jezebel had threatened to kill. Elijah met the delegation with a question. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? The question exposed the meaning of the mission. Ahaziah's servants were not making a neutral search for additional information. By passing over the Lord and traveling to Ekron, the king acted as though Israel had no God capable of answering him. Elijah then gave them the answer Ahaziah had sought. "This is what the Lord says. You will not leave the bed on which you are lying. You will certainly die." The king wanted to know whether he would recover, and the word of the Lord settled the matter before his messengers reached the foreign shrine. His attempt to consult Baal-zebub became the reason judgment was pronounced. Ahaziah would never rise from the bed to which his fall had brought him. Elijah departed. The messengers returned to the palace far sooner than expected. Ahaziah asked, "Why have you come back?" They explained that a man had met them and ordered them to return to the king. Then they repeated his message. "Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are sending men to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore you will not leave the bed on which you are lying. You will certainly die." Ahaziah asked them to describe the man. They said he wore a garment of hair with a leather belt around his waist. The king recognized him immediately. That was Elijah the Tishbite. The identification connected Ahaziah's sentence with the prophet who had confronted his father. Elijah did not need to enter the palace or introduce himself. His appearance and his message were enough. The royal house knew the man whose word had repeatedly stood against its worship. Ahaziah responded by sending a captain with 50 soldiers to Elijah. They found the prophet sitting on top of a hill. The captain climbed toward him and delivered the king's command. "Man of God," the king says, "come down." The title acknowledged Elijah's religious identity, but the force behind the words belonged to the crown. 50 armed men had been sent to bring one prophet down from the hill. Ahaziah could not reverse the sentence through Baal-zebub, so he attempted to summon the man who had spoken it. Elijah answered the captain, "If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Fire came down from heaven and consumed the captain and his company. The king had called Elijah a man of God through the mouth of his officer, but he treated him as someone royal force could compel. Elijah placed the truth of the title before a sign. If he truly represented God, then the king's 50 soldiers did not give the captain control of the encounter. The fire recalled Carmel, but its object had changed. On the mountain before Ahab, fire consumed the offering and brought the people to confession. Here it fell upon a military company sent by Ahab's son to enforce a royal command against the prophet. Ahaziah sent another captain with another 50 men. The destruction of the first company did not cause him to abandon the attempt. He repeated it with the same number of soldiers. The second captain reached Elijah and spoke even more urgently. "Man of God, this is what the king says. Come down at once." He added speed to the demand, as though greater insistence could overcome what had happened to the first company. The order still treated the king's authority as decisive. Elijah was expected to descend because Ahaziah had commanded it. Elijah gave the same answer. "If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." The fire of God came down again and consumed the second captain and his company. 100 soldiers and 2 commanders had now been lost in the attempt to seize Elijah. Ahaziah remained in bed, unable to rise, while the forces sent in his name could not bring the prophet from the hill. The king sent a third captain with another 50 men. This officer approached differently. He went up, fell on his knees before Elijah, and pleaded with him, "Man of God, please let my life and the lives of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight. Fire has fallen from heaven and consumed the first 2 captains and all their men, but now let my life be precious in your sight." The third captain had received the same royal assignment, but he did not behave as though his rank or the soldiers behind him gave him power over Elijah. He acknowledged what had happened to the previous companies and asked for mercy. He also called his 50 men Elijah's servants, rather than presenting them as the king's force sent to command him. The shift in language matched his posture on the ground. He did not deny Ahaziah's order, but he refused to repeat the presumption of the men who came before him. The angel of the Lord spoke to Elijah, "Go down with him. Do not be afraid of him." The third company was spared. Elijah rose from the hill and went with the captain to the palace. Ahaziah had attempted to compel his appearance, but Elijah came under divine instruction rather than because royal force had prevailed. The soldiers escorted him, yet the command governing his movement came from the Lord. Elijah stood before the injured king. He did not soften the message now that he was inside the palace. He repeated the accusation and the sentence directly to Ahaziah. "This is what the Lord says. Because you sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, as though there were no god in Israel whose word you could seek, you will never leave the bed on which you are lying. You will certainly die." The confrontation resolved the question Ahaziah's original delegation had carried. He would not recover. The answer came from the God he had ignored, through the prophet he had tried to summon by force. Ahaziah died according to the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. His reign ended without a son to succeed him. The judgment against Ahab's house had not yet reached its complete execution, but the dynasty had narrowed. Ahab was dead. Ahaziah was dead. The throne passed sideways within the family rather than forward to a new generation of Ahaziah's descendants. Joram, another son of Ahab, became king in his place. Years later, Joram was fighting the Arameans at Ramoth-gilead, the city where Ahab had fallen. Wounded in battle against Hazael's forces, he returned to Jezreel to recover. At Ramoth-gilead, Elisha summoned one of the prophetic company and gave him a flask of oil. "Find Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi," he said. "Take him into an inner room, pour the oil upon his head, and say, 'This is what the Lord says, I anoint you king over Israel.' Then open the door and run." The young prophet obeyed. Jehu was sitting with fellow commanders when the messenger arrived. He took Jehu aside, poured oil over his head, and announced that he had been anointed to strike the house of Ahab. The blood of the Lord's prophets and servants would be avenged against Jezebel. Ahab's entire male line would be cut off, and Jezebel would be eaten by dogs in Jezreel without burial. Then the messenger opened the door and fled. When Jehu returned, the officers demanded to know what had happened. He initially dismissed the visitor, but they pressed him. Jehu told them that the prophet had anointed him king over Israel. The commanders immediately spread their garments beneath Jehu on the bare steps. They blew a trumpet and shouted, "Jehu is king!" The judgment first announced to Elijah at Horeb had found its executor. Jehu warned the commanders that no one should leave Ramoth-gilead to carry news to Jezreel. He then rode toward the city where Joram was recovering, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, had come to visit him. A watchman on Jezreel's tower saw Jehu's company approaching. Joram sent a horseman to ask whether they came in peace. Jehu ordered the messenger to fall in behind him. A second messenger received the same answer. The watchman reported that neither man was returning. Then he recognized the style of the approaching chariot. "The driving is like that of Jehu, son of Nimshi," he said. "He drives furiously." Joram ordered his chariot prepared. He and Ahaziah rode out separately to meet Jehu. They encountered him at the property of Naboth. "Do you come in peace, Jehu?" Joram asked. "What peace can there be?" Jehu answered, "as long as the prostitution and sorceries of your mother Jezebel continue." Joram turned his chariot and cried to Ahaziah, "Treachery!" Jehu drew his bow with full strength. The arrow struck Joram between the shoulders and passed through his heart. The king collapsed in his chariot. Jehu ordered his officer Bidkar to lift the body and throw it onto Naboth's field. He recalled that years earlier, while he and Bidkar rode behind Ahab, the Lord had pronounced judgment for the blood of Naboth and his sons. Joram's body was cast upon the land his father had taken. Ahaziah fled. Jehu's men pursued and wounded him near Ibleam. He escaped as far as Megiddo, where he died. His servants carried him to Jerusalem and buried him in the tomb of his fathers. Jehu continued to Jezreel. When Jezebel heard that he had arrived, she painted her eyes, arranged her hair, and looked down from a palace window. As Jehu entered the gate, she called, "Do you come in peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" Zimri had killed an Israelite king and seized the throne, only to die 7 days later. Jezebel greeted Jehu by comparing him to a condemned usurper. Even with her son dead and Jehu entering the city, she addressed him from above and named him as a servant who had murdered his king. Jehu looked up at the window. "Who is on my side?" he called. "Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down toward him. "Throw her down," Jehu ordered. They threw Jezebel from the window. Her blood struck the wall and the horses, and Jehu's chariot trampled her. Then he entered the palace and ate and drank. Afterward, Jehu said, "Attend to that cursed woman and bury her, for she was a king's daughter." The order came too late. The servants went out, but found only her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. They returned and reported what remained. Jehu recognized the fulfillment. "This is the word of the Lord spoken through Elijah the Tishbite. On the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will eat Jezebel's flesh. Her body will be like refuse on the ground, so that no one will be able to say, 'This is Jezebel.'" The queen who had commanded the death of Naboth was denied an identifiable grave beside the land she had taken for Ahab. Her royal ancestry could not secure her burial. The palace window from which she confronted Jehu became the place from which she fell into Elijah's sentence. But Jezebel's death was only the beginning of Jehu's commission. Ahab's house still had 70 sons and royal descendants in Samaria. They were under the care of city officials, elders, and guardians. Jehu wrote to those leaders and challenged them to select the strongest of Ahab's sons, place him on the throne, and fight for the dynasty. The officials were terrified. 2 kings could not withstand him, they said. "How can we?" They sent their submission to Jehu. "We are your servants. We will do whatever you say. We will not make anyone king." Jehu sent a second letter. If they truly belonged to him, they were to bring the heads of Ahab's sons to Jezreel by the following day. The guardians slaughtered all 70. They placed their heads in baskets and sent them to Jehu. He ordered the heads piled in 2 heaps at the city gate until morning. Then he stood before the people. "You are innocent," he said. "I conspired against my master and killed him, but who killed all these?" The leaders of Samaria had carried out Jehu's command, making themselves participants in the destruction of the dynasty they had once served. Jehu then directed attention beyond the conspiracy. "Know that not one word the Lord spoke against the house of Ahab will fail. The Lord has done what he declared through Elijah." Jehu killed everyone remaining from Ahab's house in Jezreel, including his officials, close associates, and priests. He left no survivor capable of preserving the old royal establishment. On the road to Samaria, he met 42 relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah. They were traveling to greet the families of Ahab and Jezebel, unaware of what had happened. Jehu ordered them taken alive and then killed at the pit of Beth-Eked. Farther along, he met Jehonadab, son of Rechab. "Is your heart loyal to me as mine is to yours?" Jehu asked. "It is," Jehonadab answered. Jehu took his hand and brought him into the chariot. "Come with me," he said, "and see my zeal for the Lord." They entered Samaria together, and Jehu destroyed the remaining members of Ahab's house there. One part of the royal system still remained. The state-supported worship of Baal. Jehu announced, "Ahab served Baal a little. Jehu will serve him much." It was a deception intended to draw Baal's servants into one place. Jehu ordered a solemn assembly and demanded the presence of every prophet, worshipper, and priest of Baal. Anyone absent would die. The temple filled from one end to the other. Special garments were distributed to the worshippers. Jehu and Jehonadab entered and made certain that no servant of the Lord was among them. Only Baal's worshippers were to remain. Outside, Jehu stationed 80 armed men. "If any of the men I place in your hands escapes," he warned them, "your life will answer for his." After the sacrifices were completed, Jehu ordered the guards and officers to enter. "Go in and kill them. Let no one escape." The soldiers struck down Baal's worshippers and threw their bodies aside. Then they entered the inner part of the temple, brought out its sacred pillar and burned it. They demolished the pillar and tore down the temple itself, turning the site into a latrine. The Baal establishment Ahab had built and Jezebel had defended was eradicated from Israel. Its prophets had died at Carmel, its royal patrons were dead, its worshippers were trapped and destroyed, and its temple became a place of refuse. The Lord told Jehu that because he had carried out the judgment against Ahab's house, his descendants would sit upon Israel's throne through the 4th generation. Yet Jehu did not carefully follow the Lord with his whole heart. He continued the worship of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. The agent who destroyed Ahab's Baal system did not restore Israel to undivided allegiance. Jehu removed the dynasty and its foreign cult, but preserved the older royal religion that had served the northern kingdom since its beginning. During his reign, the Lord began reducing Israel's territory. Hazael defeated Israel across the lands east of the Jordan, the same foreign ruler named in the commission given to Elijah at Horeb. Jehu ruled for 28 years and was buried in Samaria. His son Jehoahaz succeeded him. Ahab's ivory palace no longer belonged to Ahab's house. Jezebel had no grave at Jezreel. Baal's temple lay demolished, while the calves at Bethel and Dan remained standing beneath another king.